December 22nd, 1944. Over the frozen Ardennes. The air itself trembled under the sound of engines and distant thunder. The Battle of the Bulge was at its height, and above the snow-drowned forests of Belgium, streaks of silver carved through the cold, each one carrying men who had seen too much sky and too many friends fall from it. The morning sun struggled to pierce the gray veil of cloud, casting a pale light over a war that had outlived the warmth of reason. Among those streaks was one Mustang painted with the ghost of a falcon across its nose. Its pilot was Captain Nathaniel Hale, 26 years old. Of the 357th Fighter Group, it's a man whose courage was visible to all but himself. Nathaniel had grown up under the Missouri sun. On a farm where every sunrise had once felt eternal, his father had been a preacher, his mother a school teacher, and he'd learned early that silence held more truth than most sermons. When he first took to the skies in a Curtiss P-40 during training, he'd written home that flying felt like holding God's breath in your hands. After 3 years of war, after Italy, Normandy, and the endless German flak, God felt far away. Now, as his Mustang Silver Ghost sliced through the brittle morning air, Nate felt the old ghosts pressing against him. The canopy was half-frosted, the engine vibration a rhythm that lived in his bones. On his radio, the crackle of voices filled the space between heartbeats. Eagle 2. This is Eagle Lead. Check in, Eagle 2. Loud and clear came a voice that was Lieutenant Jimmy Rourke, Nate's wingman, the youngest of their squadron. Still barely 20, Nate pressed his mic. Eagle Lead copies. Stay tight, Jimmy. Command says Jerry's pushing tanks through St. Vith. We keep their air cover off our boys. Roger that, Captain. Just keep me alive long enough to buy you a drink in London. Nate almost smiled. Almost. Make it 2, Lieutenant. The world below was white chaos, forests like spilled ink against snow. Roads choked with armor, men, and the black scars of artillery. Their mission was clear: intercept any Luftwaffe ground attack groups trying to strike the American columns. But the weather was treacherous. The cloud cover thick enough to swallow a squadron whole as they broke through a patch of open sky. Nate caught sight of something glinting far ahead, tiny specks moving in formation. He squinted. Eyes up, boys. 12 high, heading east. Looks like 190s, Rourke's voice came, laced with nerves. How many, Cap? Enough to make it interesting. He eased the throttle, the Merlin engine roaring. The Mustangs banked into the sun, using its glare as a veil. Below them, the German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s, cruised toward the front lines, likely hunting bombers. Nate counted at least 12. Outnumbered 2-1. Eagle flight, we go in 2 pairs. Jimmy, you're with me. The rest, swing wide and hit them when they break. We make the first cut count. Copy that, came a chorus of tense affirmations. As they dove, the world turned into sound and speed. Wind screamed against the canopy. The sun burst into their eyes. Nate lined up his gun sight on the lead German. The reticle pulsed red. For a moment, everything was perfectly still, the breath before the storm. Then he fired. Tracers ripped through the sky, slicing across the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. Flames erupted from the engine, the German plane spiraling down in a trail of black smoke. Rourke whooped over the radio. You got him, Captain. But before Nate could reply, another burst of cannon fire tore past his left wing. Break right, he shouted. Both Mustangs veered apart as the sky filled with streaks of metal. The fight dissolved into chaos, twisting contrails, screaming engines, flashes of death. Nate rolled hard, came around on the tail of another 190, but it vanished into a cloud bank. His stomach pressed against his harness as the G-forces crushed him. Through the static of the radio, he heard Jimmy. Cap, I've got one on me. Damn it, he's right on my 6. Hang on, Jimmy. I'm coming. Nate yanked the stick, diving through the mist, eyes scanning for the flash of tracer fire. The clouds tore open and there below was Jimmy's P-51, twisting wildly. A 190 glued to its tail. Nate lined up his guns, breathed once, and fired. The German peeled off, smoke trailing from his wing. Jimmy's plane leveled, wobbling but alive. Jesus, thanks, Cap, Jimmy gasped. Thought I was done for. Keep your head up, kid. We're not done yet. The engagement raged another 5 minutes, though in the air, time was elastic, stretching and snapping between seconds. When it was over, 6 German planes burned in the snow. The rest vanished into the clouds. 2 of Nate's own squadron were gone. Eagle flight, form up, Nate said quietly, his throat tight. We're heading home. But the word home was a fragile illusion. The airfield at Liston, a patch of mud and steel somewhere in eastern England, was barely a home, more a place to survive between sorties. As the Mustangs limped through gray skies back across the channel, Nate's mind played a cruel loop. The image of a falling plane, spiraling fire. A scream that never reached the radio. He thought of Eddie Marks, his old squadron mate who'd gone down over Normandy 6 months ago. Eddie had been like a brother, a joker, the one who'd always carried a photograph of his fiancée in his flight jacket. The same fiancée who now wrote to Nate instead. Her letters aching with questions he couldn't answer. That guilt clung to him like frost. He'd promised Eddie he'd bring him home. He'd failed. When they landed, the airfield looked like a battlefield in itself. Slick mud, broken fencing, crews rushing to refuel and rearm. The smell of oil, cordite, and exhaustion hung in the air. As Nate climbed down from his Mustang, the ground crew chief, a burly sergeant named Mendez, met him with a grim nod. 2 birds didn't make it back, sir, Mendez said. Davis and Kellerman. Nate removed his gloves slowly, his hands trembling despite the cold. They fought like hell. Yes, sir. They always do. Inside the briefing hut, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and silence. Maps of Belgium covered the walls, red strings marking the shifting front lines. Colonel McHale, their commanding officer, stood near the stove, his face carved from fatigue. Good work out there, McHale said, without looking up. Intel says your group saved a convoy outside Malmedy. Enemy air cover never reached them. Davis and Kellerman didn't make it back, Nate replied. McHale exhaled. Neither did half of Easy Company this morning. It's a hard winter, Cole. Harder than any of us deserve. Nate nodded, but his eyes were far away. That night, in the dim light of the officers' quarters, Nate sat at his bunk with a flask and a letter half-written. The room was quiet, except for the murmur of wind against the tin roof. Jimmy Rourke was at the next cot, polishing his boots like it was a ritual against death. You ever think about what we'll do after this? Jimmy asked suddenly. After, Nate echoed, as though the concept was foreign. Yeah. I mean, when it's over, you'll go home, right? Back to Missouri? Maybe find a girl? Raise a family? Nate stared at the letter. I don't know, Jimmy. I used to think I'd build something. A barn, maybe? A life. But now, I don't know what's left to build. Jimmy smirked, trying to lighten it. Guess we'll just have to win first. Nate managed a faint grin. Yeah, guess so. Soft orchestral music, somber strings fade in the days that followed, blurred into a rhythm of flight and loss. The weather worsened, the missions multiplied. The Luftwaffe was desperate, bleeding but still dangerous, a dying beast with teeth. Nate flew every sortie, his logbook filling with notations that read like epitaphs. Each dawn brought another briefing, another map with new red lines, another chance not to come back. But something inside him had shifted since that last dogfight. For the first time, Nate wasn't sure if his courage came from duty or from guilt. The turning point came on January 1st, 1945, when word reached Leiston that the Germans were planning a massive surprise offensive, Operation Bodenplatte, an airstrike aimed to cripple Allied airfields across Europe in a single morning. When the order came, Nate didn't hesitate. We'll be ready, he told McHale. They're coming for our skies. Let's make sure they choke on them. Colonel nodded. You're leading the counterstrike, Cole. This one's yours. Nate didn't feel pride, only the weight of what that meant. The radio room smelled of hot paper and cigarette smoke the night before New Year's. The maps on the table creased and smudged as if the men who touched them had been rubbing away fate with their thumbs. Outside, the rain had turned to a sleet that rhymed the runway, and made every step a careful negotiation with gravity. Nate sat hunched over the map, the lamplight carving his face into shadow and bone. Colonel McHale moved around the hut with the practiced economy of a man who had seen too many plans fail and too few succeed. "They'll try to catch us on the ground," the colonel said. "Bodenplatte's meant to be a dagger between our wings. They want hangars, fuel dumps, fighters grounded. If we're in the air, we blunt the strike." The words were blunt as a bayonet, but they were also a promise. If they could put Mustangs and Thunderbolts into the sky, the Luftwaffe might lose the last thin thread they had left to breathe. Nate thought of Eddie, and of Kellerman and Davis, of faces he could still see as clearly as if they sat in the hut with him. He thought of the photograph Eddie had carried, a laughing girl with braid flying, and he swallowed the old, stubborn need to keep promises made in bloody moments. Promise-keeping, in his mind, had become a ledger. Each life owed was a line of debt, and his sum was rising. He pushed his palms to his eyes until he saw sparks. "We'll be ready," he told McHale, the way a man tells himself a lie to make it true. The colonel looked at him with something like pity and command woven together. "You lead the scramble when it comes. Get in the air fast. Don't gamble on the weather." Dawn on January 1st was a hard, metallic gray. The airfield at Liston looked like a toy village under a magnifying glass. Now, tiny trucks and tin hats rushing like ants along the perimeter. Mechanics in oil-splattered coats moved with urgent choreography, wheeling fuel drums, heaving ammunition crates, and bolting cover plates back onto battered fuselages. The Mustangs slept with their noses bowed, engines like thunder caged in their bellies. Jimmy Rourke paced, cigarette dangling, adrenaline skittering under his skin. "You ever think about not going up?" he asked Nate, voice a rough whisper. It was the kind of question men asked one another when they needed permission to be afraid. Nate met the young lieutenant's eyes and found his own reflection there, a pale, tired man. "Not today," he said. "Not when the others are on the ground." Jimmy let the cigarette go and ground it under his boot, as if that small act would anchor him to the earth. The call came, like it always did in the end, clipped sharp. The sound of other people's urgency cutting across the tent like a blade. Scramble. Scramble. Luftwaffe inbound, multiple airfields targeted. The entire base snapped into motion, every man becoming a measure of speed and purpose. Engines coughed, sparked, then roared alive as crews pushed the Mustangs out into the wet and waited for taxi clearance. Nate strapped in, the seatbelt cutting into his shoulders, the headset familiar as a mother's hand. The world outside the glass seemed smaller, reduced to the size of a man's heartbeat, he thought, for a ridiculous second. Of his father's farm and the rows of corn that had once stood patient under an American sky. That sky seemed a memory now, stolen by iron and fire. They climbed through a patchwork of cloud, the world below a quilt of white and slate. Nate's squadron formed up, Mustangs shining like knives in the pale light. Through the static on the radio came the reports, hits at several airfields in the Low Countries. Destruction at Ypres, Eindhoven, German fighters descending like a rash. The radio voice was taut with disbelief and anger. "They hit the Beaufighters and the depot at Sint-Truiden," someone said. "We've got lingering formations near the front." The names came like a litany of loss. Nate felt the adrenaline sharpen into something else, clarity. This was not the time for hesitation. This was the time to answer violence with speed. When the first Focke-Wulfs appeared, they did so like a storm front suddenly, brutally, their silhouettes cutting black through the clouds. The fight that followed was not the hero's ballet Nate had sometimes imagined in idle moments. It was close and brutal and screamed with the intimacy of survival. Tracers stitched the air into ribbons. Planes rolled and dove in frantic tangles. The sky smelled of burning fuel and the little metallic temps of spent gunpowder. Under the roar and the panic, Nate found his rhythm, a calculation of angles. The small betrayals his hands made to muscle memory. He led the attack with a trust honed by months of flying and by the shared certainty that they would not lie down. 2:00. Low, bandits. Jimmy's voice broke through the noise. Nate twisted the stick and fell into pursuit of a dark shape. A Focke-Wulf shuddered as bullets found its engine. It flamed, and began to fall like a murdered star. Nate watched, not triumphant, but steady. The sight of another plane descending burned a hollow in him. Each victory in the air felt like buying time with someone else's life. He remembered Eddie's grin and hated it for its innocence. He remembered Kellerman's hands, always steady, and Davis's habit of humming whenever the clouds grew thick. The ledger in his head ticked. Mid-morning, after the first flurry, the Germans changed tactics. They surged in low, their intent clear, hit the fields, set the Mustangs ablaze, strangle the Allied response. Nate and his flight dove, intercepting the strafing runs with an anger that tasted of justice and terror. They broke up bomber formations, strafed ground attack planes, and in the chaos, they found themselves above a column of German tanks crawling through the Ardennes, their black shapes a contradiction to the white earth. Nate called the sight into the radio and felt a coldness spread. The presence of so much iron moving with so much purpose was a reminder of what was at stake on the ground. The men below who depended, in a way they might never fully understand, on the thin shadow of fighters overhead. Then came the moment that would cleave this time into before and after. As Nate chased a 190 that twisted like a fish beneath the clouds, his mirror caught a flash, a wing turning, a wing trailing smoke. He swore and banked. The plane was one of their own, spiraling towards the trees. It was Lieutenant Ror. The world narrowed to two pieces: Jimmy's small, desperate aircraft and the ground that rose to greet it. Nate pushed the Mustang lower than protocol allowed, skimming the treetops, the world a smudge of green and white. He saw Jimmy's face through the canopy, wide-eyed, a child's mouth open in an animal scream. Nate fired until his guns clicked empty, but there was no guarantee bullets could fix what flak had already undone. Jimmy. He screamed into the empty space the radio left him. The words reached his ears like a hand striking a drum. He had been thinking of drinking a bottle in London with the boy, of futures they had no right to. Those thoughts dissolved into a single decision. He broke formation, dove, and pulled his Mustang low enough to risk the protocols he'd been told to obey since flight school. The trees rushed past his wings, a blur of bark and needle. Engines roared, and for an instant, the world was nothing but velocity and the metallic thump of his heart. He saw where Jimmy would hit a small clearing, a ravine rim, and he aimed for it with a desperation born of grief. Nate's Mustang landed hard and skidded, bumping, kicking up snow like confetti, coming to rest near the smoking wreckage of another plane. He leaped out before the engine even cooled, sprinting across the ground that smelled suddenly of smoke and pine resin. Jimmy lay half crumpled, the canopy torn, blood seeping slow and red through his flight jacket. He was alive, breathing, but the breath was thin, like a candle struggling in wind. Nate dropped beside him, hands fumbling for a medic kit he did not have the right words to ask for. "Jimmy, stay with me," he said, voice breaking in a way that made him hate himself for sounding like a child. Jimmy's blue eyes looked at him, not entirely clear. "Cap," he murmured, and then a small, sudden grin. "You owe me that drink." The radio chatter grew like thunder, a terrible surf of commands and casualty reports. A medic reached them, cursing and efficient, and with warm hands that smelled of disinfectant, he began to work. Nate hovered, an impossible weight compressing his chest. He was terrified and angry, furious at the arbitrary way war took, and the way it sometimes left men alive to live with memory. He thought of the ledger again, the debt of hearts. Why had he broken formation? Because a boy he liked had been falling, and the only ledger that mattered in the moment was the one where names were still warm enough to be changed. Jimmy survived, a detail that would become a small miracle recorded in the squadron log. His recovery was not linear. Hospital beds and convalescence, and the long, awkward step of learning to live without the simple assumption that tomorrow would arrive unbroken. Nate visited him when he could, feeling awkward in the sterile hospital rooms where men wore fear like a second skin. Jimmy's rehabilitation had a way of illuminating the costs, the parts of war that were not cinematic, but bureaucratic and painful and real. He learned to walk again with the help of therapists who spoke in a voice flattened by routine to a point of cruelty. Nate offered him cigarettes, which Jimmy accepted with a crooked smile. Though neither of them really wanted to smoke, it was an act of communion. The days after Bodenplatte were a different grist. The Luftwaffe's attack had been a blow, savage, but not decisive. The Allied response had been brutal and unforgiving, and the balance of power in the skies shifted in that small, incremental way history does. A plane saved here, a depot rebuilt there. The victory was granular, a million small resistances made by hands and fuel and resolve. Nate flew again and again, a machine with memory that sometimes slipped its gears. He became at once more careful and more reckless, a contradiction only someone who had learned to trust the edge could hold. He started carrying, tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket, one of Eddie's old buttons. A small thing that had survived a crash and a burn and had somehow made its way to Nate. He touched it like a prayer before every mission, feeling its faint warmth, as if that round piece of metal could anchor all the promises he could not bear to break. At night, when the cold pressed against the barracks and the men's laughter became a brittle thing, Nate found himself speaking to people in letter form he never sent. He wrote to Eddie's fiancée once, and then burned the letter. He wrote to his father, and left the envelope unopened. It felt ridiculous, these attempts at human order in the midst of chaos. But the act of trying to make sense of things, of placing words like bricks against the flood, gave him something he could hold on to. The simple rituals of writing, of polishing the leather of his gloves, of checking his instruments with a surgeon's meticulousness, kept the terror at bay long enough to sleep. Quiet piano, a single, steady note music cue for introspection. The turning point was not a singular thunderbolt moment, but a gradual dawning. The slow melting of ice that revealed what lay under. Nate realized he could no longer place himself outside the ledger of losses, tallying names as if currency. He had to transform the guilt into something that moved, into action that meant he would risk more than calculation. The war had taught him to fly by instruments and by instinct. Now, it demanded he fly by honor. The question was not whether he would risk himself for men like Jimmy, but how he would allow the memory of the fallen to guide him toward the kind of courage that matched their sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, the 357th found rhythm again. They escorted bombers across Germany, strafed supply trains, and took part in the grinding push that would eventually break the spine of the German advance. Nate's name circulated in the briefings, mentioned without flourish. Cole's flight made contact. Cole downed too. The mentions felt incomplete, like a name given without the rest of a sentence. He didn't care for recognition. What mattered was the narrow, terrifying act of surviving long enough to make a difference. On an afternoon that smelled faintly of spring, though the calendar stubbornly insisted on winter, Nate climbed into his Mustang and took to the sky. The fields below stretched out, patchwork, and in the distance, the Ardennes rose like a dark thumbprint on the land. He thought of Eddie, and of Kellerman, and Davis, and of Jimmy, whose recovery had been slow, and whose voice, when he finally made it back to flight, status had a scratch in it like a record out of tune. "You kept your promise, Cap," Jimmy said one afternoon, clapping Nate on the shoulder with both hands. "Hard to believe you flew like you had something to pay off." Nate smiled, not answering. The ledger had no neat end. The debt remained. But something else had started to seed itself beneath the frost. A sense that beyond debt there could be repair. And a life after the sum was paid might be possible. The battles ahead would test that resolve. The Ardennes still bled, and the war's cruelty was patient, waiting for the moment men let down their guard. Yet for now, in the thin invisible space between two fights, Nathaniel Cole allowed himself a single, private breath. He touched the round piece of metal in his pocket, the button from Eddie's jacket, and closed his eyes. The sky seemed to hold him for one heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, the future, uncertain, terrifying, faintly promising, whispered that he could live with the ledger if he learned to turn the sum of loss into something like action, to honor the dead by the living choices he made. The winter sky over Belgium in early January possessed a strange, deceptive stillness, like a held breath before a scream. Frost clung to tree branches and crystalline lattice, the world painted in whites and blues that belied the violence beneath. Columns of Allied armor crawled along narrow roads carved through the Ardennes, engines rasping like tired lungs. In the distance, gunfire flickered like small angry stars. The front had not frozen despite the cold. It moved, strained, bucked, and bled. And above it, day after day, the 357th Fighter Group carved their patrol arcs across the gray sky. Captain Nathaniel Hale felt the fatigue in ways he hadn't before. Quiet ways, insidious ways. Not in the hands, which still moved with disciplined precision over the stick and throttle. Not in the eyes, which remained sharp enough to distinguish a Messerschmitt's silhouette at 3 miles. No, the fatigue took root in his thoughts, in the murmurs just below consciousness. It crept in whenever he lingered too long between missions. In those gaps, the grief he kept at bay swelled like a tide pressing against a dam. Still, he rose before dawn, pulled on his flight gear, checked his Mustang with ritualistic focus. That normalcy, that repetition, was its own defense. Even as he stood at his aircraft, smoking the first cigarette of the morning, he felt the old resolve stiffen like a spine under strain. Jimmy Rourke had returned to duty at the start of the second week of January. His limp was barely noticeable, but Nate saw it anyway, saw the stiffness in the young man's left leg, the subtle way he adjusted his stance when the cold bit too sharply through worn boots. Yet Jimmy insisted he was ready. The flight surgeon had finally signed off. Got cleared this morning, he had said, smiling as if permission to return to mortal danger was a gift. Nate had clapped him on the back. Good to have you with us again, Lieutenant. Jimmy's grin was quick, but there was something behind it now, something quieter, weightier, a shadow that looked not unlike Nate's own. War-aged men in unkind ways. Sometimes it didn't ask permission. That day's briefing was terse. A German armored division had been spotted, repositioning near the Schweinfurt. Intelligence suggested they would attempt to break out toward Antwerp if the pressures slackened. Allied bombers needed escort protection, and the 357th was tasked with keeping the sky clean long enough for the heavies to punch a hole in the enemy's threat. Colonel McHale stood at the front of the tent, pointer tapping the map. His voice rolled over the fighters like gravel. Expect strong Luftwaffe resistance. They're wounded, and that makes them mean. Cole, you take first flight. Sweep ahead of the bomb groups. Hunt anything with a cross on its wing. Nate nodded. The plan was familiar. Sweep, clear, hold the line. But beneath the strategic clarity lay a murkier truth, the kind men didn't say aloud. The Germans were desperate now. Desperation made them terrifying. A cornered enemy could do impossible things. Back at his Mustang, Nate touched the button he kept in his pocket. The metal was warm from his body heat. Eddie's button. The last surviving piece of a man who'd fallen into a Normandy orchard nearly a year ago. The gilt had changed shape since Bodenplatte. No longer a shackle, but a blade he chose to carry, a reminder of the cost of hesitation. He fastened his harness, pulled the canopy down, and the cockpit sealed around him like an iron womb. The engines roared awake. Minutes later, the Mustang wheels left the ground, slicing through the brittle morning air. The world below fell away, tanks becoming toys, rivers becoming scars of cobalt. His flight formed up behind him, 8 silver birds, shining like knives in the sun that finally broke through the cloud front. Jimmy's Mustang flew off Nate's right, its engine note distinct, slightly rougher. Nate glanced over, saw Jimmy's familiar thumbs up through the canopy, returned the gesture. The sky widened as they climbed. For almost 40 minutes, the patrol was uneventful. Cold seeped through metal. The monotony of altitude made thought drift. Nate kept replaying the image of Jimmy spiraling earthward weeks earlier, kept hearing the scream, though he knew memory was shaping it. Trauma had its own voice. It sometimes spoke in tones the living never made. Then the radio crackled. Eagle led. This is Red Tail Command, Boogie's inbound. Vector 0-8-5. Dozens, possibly more. Nate's stomach coiled with the familiar tension. Copy, command. Eagle flight, tighten up. Moments later, he saw them. Dark specks against the pale haze growing, splitting, forming tactical shapes. Messerschmitt Bf-19Zs, Focke-Wulf 190s, a big formation. Bigger than anything he'd seen in weeks. Jimmy whistled softly through the radio. "That's a lot, enough to keep you focused," Nate said. The enemy fighters banked together, descending in coordinated lines. The Luftwaffe's flight discipline was unmistakable even now, battered and depleted as they were. These pilots weren't rookies. They moved with the grace of men fighting with their backs to a wall. Nate toggled his guns, two armed. "Boys, let's go to work." They dove. The sky erupted. The two formations collided like storms slamming together. Muzzle flashes stitched the air. Black smoke trails twisted like torn banners. Nate fired on the first 109 that crossed his sights. It rolled, dove, spit bullets, climbed. He followed, feeling the G-force claw at his ribs. The German pilot was skilled, disciplined. He fought like a man who expected to die and meant to take someone with him. Nate fired again. His rounds struck the enemy's wing root. The Messerschmitt broke into a tumble of flame. Another lunged at him, a 190, its radial engine screaming like a banshee. Tracer rounds stitched across Nate's left wing. Metal chipped away. His Mustang shook, coughed, recovered. He jerked hard into a roll, pulled a maneuver that tightened his body into a vise. The 190 overshot. Nate pulled the trigger. The 190 disintegrated into black confetti. But numbers mattered, and the Luftwaffe had them today. Eagle led. "I've got 3 on me," came a pilot's voice behind Nate Rollins, a Georgia boy who always doodled pinups in the margins of his notes. The panic in his tone made Nate's blood chill. "Brake left." "Rollins, I'm coming." He pushed forward, dropping altitude. Hunting for Rollins' silver shape among the dancing fire of dogfighting machines, he found him, a Mustang twisting wildly. 3 Messerschmitts crawling behind it like wolves. Nate fired, taking the tailing German in the fuselage. Pieces flew. Rollins pulled hard right. Nate dove at the second enemy, but the third peeled off and fired. Rollins' Mustang spun. "Rollins!" Nate shouted, but Rollins' radio emitted only static and screaming metal. The plane hit the woods. Nate's teeth clenched until his jaw trembled. "Damn it!" Jimmy's voice cut in. "Cap, more bandits incoming from High 7. They're pushing us off the bombers." Nate looked south. In the distance, the air shimmered with the oncoming bomber groups. B-17s and B-24s flying like lumbering castles in the sky. And descending on them was another wave of Luftwaffe fighters. If those fighters reached the heavies, hundreds of bomber crewmen would die. This was the moment. This was the fracture line. The place where either courage broke or fate did. "Eagle flight, follow me." Nate shouted. "We intercept the second wave." I repeat, follow me. He banked hard, throttle wide open. The Merlin engine howled. The Mustang shot into the fray like an arrow. A shadow fell over him, Jimmy. The kid had followed without hesitation. His damaged leg, his bruised ribs, his weeks of pain, none of it mattered. He was there, loyal to the end. Nate felt a fierce surge in his chest. "Stay tight." Jimmy always do. They hit the second wave just as the bombers began their long, terrifying crossing over the German lines. Nate's flight now reduced, bleeding, battered, slammed into the 109 formation with savage precision. They fired through clouds of exhaust. They rolled through nests of tracers. Bombers droned below, steady, resolute. Those men depended on Nate's small, scarred group with a trust that felt like religion. The battle devolved into chaos. Nate shot down another German, then another. The sky was smoke, fire, shrapnel. He could hardly tell friend from foe, except for the split-second flashes of insignia. A bomber limped below, flames licking its wing. Still it flew. Then he heard Jimmy's voice thin, strained. "Cap, I'm hit." Nate's heart seized where? Left side. "Don't know what controls sluggish." Nate scanned the chaos frantically. He spotted a Mustang limping, smoke trailing. "Jimmy's, I see you, Lieutenant." "Hold steady. Stay with me." Jimmy tried to laugh, but it sounded pained. "You know, I was hoping to get through one mission without you saving my sorry. His radio cut out in a burst of static. Nate dove toward him. The world blurred. The engine roared. His blood roared louder, but out of the haze, a 109 swooped behind Jimmy, guns spitting red fire. Nate banked, fired, screamed. Not him, not again. His tracers met the German first. The 109 exploded mid-air. Jimmy's Mustang shuddered. A held Nate pulled alongside him. Saw Jimmy's face pale, but determined behind the canopy. You still with me? Nate asked. Jimmy nodded weakly. Then hold on. We're not done yet. Below them, the bomber formation crossed the critical point. Flak burst around them like fistfuls of black flowers, but most were intact. The mission the whole damn fragile thing was holding. Only one pocket of German fighters remained. 6 of them. They saw the bombers breaking through. They saw Nate's group descending on them. They chose to fight anyway. Brave men. Dead men. Nate led the final charge. Nate led the final charge. There were no elegant maneuvers now. Only wild, vicious fighting. A ballet of terror. Exhaustion burned in his muscles. His breath came in gasps. His hands shook with adrenaline-fueled precision, one by one. The German fighters fell, until the sky impossibly cleared. The bombers flew on. The last German plane spiraled away in defeat. Silence fell, a raw, ringing silence. Nate inhaled the thin, freezing air. Felt something warm trickle from his nose. Blood. He didn't care. Jimmy limped his Mustang beside Nate's. Did we do it? Nate looked at the bombers shrinking into the horizon. Yeah, he whispered. We did. The radio crackled with voices, cheers, disbelief, scattered reports of damage and survival. But all of it felt distant. He'd nearly lost Jimmy again. He'd lost Rollins. Again, the ledger grew, but the mission wasn't over. The war wasn't over. And the decisive battle, and the one everyone whispered about, the one that would decide whether the bulge collapsed or held, was still coming. The sky ahead, darkened with storm clouds. Nate steadied his breathing. Let's go home. Jimmy, thought you'd never say it. The 2 Mustangs banked toward the west. Snow began to fall, and the horizon held its breath. Dawn arrived as a faint gray smear over the English horizon. The kind of cold, pale light that felt more like an omen than a sunrise. The narrator's voice slipped in quietly, as though even sound feared to disturb the tension in the air. April 11th, 1944, the day the 322nd Fighter Group would launch the most dangerous escort mission of its deployment. A mission that would determine the fate of an entire bomber wing, and in ways none of them yet understood. The fate of Nathaniel Hale himself. The briefing room felt like a tomb as the pilots gathered. Chairs shuffling against the floor, boots tapping restlessly, the air tight with unspoken fear. The map at the front of the room glowed under harsh lights, red strings stretching across Europe like veins pulsing with danger. The target, a major ball-bearing complex buried in the industrial sprawl of Schweinfurt. One of the most heavily defended sites in the Reich. Most of the men had escorted bombers to Schweinfurt before. Few such missions had ended well. Colonel Aldridge's face appeared carved from stone as he pointed to the route. We'll be with the boys of the 306th Bomb Group. They're the heart of this run. His eyes hardened. The Luftwaffe knows that too. Expect resistance the moment we cross into German airspace. They will throw everything they have at us. A murmur rippled through the room, and Nate exchanged a glance with Harris. His friend lifted his eyebrows in mock encouragement. But the shadow in his eyes betrayed the truth. Neither of them had slept more than a handful of restless minutes the night before, when the colonel dismissed them. Nate lingered near the back of the room, his fingers pressed into the wooden frame of a window. The overcast sky outside looked bruised. You good? Harris asked quietly, stepping beside him. I will be, Nate murmured. A pause. After today? Harris gave an understanding nod. Let's bring them home, Nate. The word struck him hard. Bring them home. He wondered how many families were sitting at breakfast tables across America, sipping coffee in the safety of morning light, unaware that the fate of their sons, brothers, husbands was being decided in this dim room in England. Minutes later, the P-51s lined the tarmac like silver arrows awaiting release. Clementine gleamed, sunlight brushing across her polished nose as if blessing her with one final good omen. Nate climbed the ladder, touched the name beneath the cockpit, the name that had become a mantra. Promise, a guilt, a hope, all at once, and slid into the seat. The engine roared to life, a familiar thunder that steadied his heart as the squadron taxied out. Snowflakes drifted lightly from the sky, minute and fragile, disappearing against the heat rising off the engines. The sight was eerie, like ash falling before the fire. The narrator stepped in softly, before the guns, before the smoke. Before the screaming engines clawed through the air, there was this strange, trembling stillness, the world holding its breath. The P-51S lifted in perfect formation, wheels tucking into their bellies, wings slicing the sky with clean purpose. Above 20,000 feet, the world became a cold, sharp wilderness, clouds stretching like broken plains beneath them. Ahead, the B-17s appeared, the flying fortresses, hundreds of them, their massive shapes lumbering forward with resolute weight. Seeing them always stirred something in Nate, something akin to awe. They were giants, bleeding fuel and courage in equal measure. He slid into escort position off the right, wing of a bomber named Sweet Lorraine. Its nose art of a woman in a red dress, smiling through oil stains and frost. Over the radio, he heard the bomber crew chatter, nervous jokes, clipped commands, quiet prayers. In the P-51s, silence dominated. When men spoke too much before battle, it usually meant they were afraid. When they spoke too little, it meant they understood exactly what was coming. The first German fighters appeared as dark specks far ahead, tiny shapes growing with terrifying speed. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, closing fast. Lieutenant Foley called out. Nate's hand tightened on the stick. "Stay tight," he said to his flight. "We hold until they commit." A breath, a heartbeat. Then the sky exploded. Mi-19s and FW-190s descended like a wave of steel and fire. Tracers streaked between formations, slicing the air in glowing lines. Bombers began firing their turrets, their guns shuddering as brass casings rained from their bellies. Nate banked hard, diving into the melee, Harris on his wing like a shadow. 3 fighters streaked past him and he whipped around, lining up a shot on the tail of the lead Mi-109. He fired short bursts, controlled, and saw smoke rip from its fuselage. The German fighters spiraled downward, trailing flames. But there was no satisfaction, only the immediate, reflexive search for the next threat. Another Mi-109 latched onto a B-17, tearing into its right engine. "I've got him," Nate shouted, rolling into a steep climb. He fired again, forcing the German to break off. But the bomber was already in trouble. Fire licked across its wings, spreading with horrifying speed. Parachutes blossomed like pale flowers as the crew bailed out, their bodies tiny against the endless sky. Nate watched them fall, a knot tightening in his chest. "Keep your head in it, Nate," Harris yelled as he blasted past, firing at a pursuing fighter. "They need us." Nate snapped back into action, pulled into another engagement, adrenaline burning through him. Minutes stretched into violent eternities. The squadron fought tooth and nail to protect the fortresses. But the Luftwaffe's defense was relentless. Waves of fighters rising from every direction, determined to tear through the bomber wall at any cost. Then came the turning point. A radio scream, raw, panicked, unmistakably Foley's. "I'm hit. I'm hit. I can't." His transmission cut abruptly. Nate's breath caught. "Foley, do you copy?" Foley. Nothing. He turned sharply, searching the sky. Debris glittered in the distance, a wing fragment tumbling through the air like a fallen leaf. Harris's voice shook. "God. They got him, Nate." Nate's stomach plummeted, but there was no space for grief. Not now. Not here. Instead, something inside him hardened like molten steel cooling into a blade. New wave coming in from the east. Someone called. Nate looked and saw them. Dozens more fighters, sunlight glinting off their canopies. He felt the weight of Schweinfurt looming ahead. If they failed now, the bombers would never reach the target. If they fell here, Foley's death would become just one more name swallowed by war. "Form up on me," Nate ordered, his voice steady and cold despite the chaos. "We hold the line." The words felt like someone else's, like the ghost of the commander he had always feared he wasn't. But Harris formed up behind him. So did Riley Jennings, 2 more pilots battered but unbroken. A small remnant of what had taken off that morning, but still enough to fight as the German fighters closed in. Nate felt an eerie calm settle over him. His father's absence, Isaac's memory, Foley's death, everything narrowed into a single, unified point of purpose. Responsibility did not crush him now. It defined him. "Let's finish this," he whispered to himself. And the P-51s surged forward, diving straight into the largest wave of enemy fighters any of them had ever seen. The sky was no longer blue. It had become a churning battleground of smoke, contrails burning oil, and metal fragments spiraling through the air like deadly snow. The narrator's voice returned, low and steady, as though acknowledging the weight of what was unfolding. April 11th, 1944, by noon, the mission had reached the razor's edge. The bomber formation was bleeding altitude, bleeding strength, bleeding lives, but it was still moving toward Schweinfurt, still pressing forward. Because 5 P-51 pilots refused to let it die, Nate Hale led them into the storm. The wave of Mi-109s and FW-190s bore down on the bombers like a steel avalanche, sunlight bouncing off their wings in sharp flashes. "Tighten it up," Nate called, voice steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Pick your targets. Don't waste ammo." The German fighters slashed through the formation, guns flashing. A B-17 mid-column erupted in flames, its belly splitting open as it rolled into a deadly spin. Harris shouted a curse, pulling hard right as tracers ripped through the sky behind him. Nate fired at a pursuing German fighter, blowing its rudder apart. But there were too many. The Luftwaffe was fighting like a cornered animal, vicious, desperate, unrelenting. Nate knew why. Schweinfurt was critical. The Reich could not afford to lose these factories. If the bombers succeeded, months of enemy production would crumble. The Germans were throwing everything they had into stopping it, and yet the bombers kept going. Their resolve matched only by the stubborn, reckless courage of the P-51 pilots guarding them. Riley's voice cracked through the radio. "I'm dry, Nate. I'm out. Then stay with the fortresses and watch for stragglers," Nate ordered. Riley peeled back, drifting toward the bombers. Nate didn't tell him how proud he was. There was no time. Harris screamed, "Two, on your tail, Nate." Nate jerked hard. Left G-forces crushed his ribs, blood rushed from his head, and the world darkened for a heartbeat. Tracers streaked past his canopy. One round clipped his left wingtip, sending a burst of sparks into the wind. He rolled, dove, climbed his Mustang, responding like a living thing, fast and angry and fearless. Then he caught sight of something that froze the air in his lungs. Straight ahead, the industrial sprawl of Schweinfurt. Black flak clouds erupted across the sky as anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the heavens with thunder. The bombers bucked in the turbulence, their formation tightening as they approached the drop line. They had made it. Barely impossibly, but they had made it. A surge of emotion hit Nate so hard he almost forgot to breathe. He could picture Foley's grin if he'd lived to see this moment. He could picture Isaac, to a different time, a different kind of loss, but the same ache in his chest. They hadn't died for nothing. Nathaniel Hale, Harris muttered over the radio, breathless, "You crazy son of a look at M. They're going to make the run." Flak peppered the sky in monstrous bursts. A B-17 lost half a wing and tumbled into the smoke below. Another limped, engines failing, yet fought to stay in formation. But the rest pushed forward, and then bombs away. Bombs away. Voices shouted from the bomber crews. Thousands of pounds of explosives fell in synchronized release, disappearing into the chaos below. For a suspended moment, the entire formation seemed to float, as if gravity itself paused in respect. Then the shockwave hit. A bloom of fire and smoke erupted from the factory complex, rising like a monstrous black flower. Secondary explosions rippled through the streets and warehouses as fuel, machinery, munitions caught fire. The earth trembled beneath the sky. The narrator spoke softly, almost reverent. The ball-bearing works of Schweinfurt, the beating heart of German war production, had been struck, and struck hard. Relief flickered across Nate's chest, but it lasted only seconds. "They're coming back for another pass," Jennings warned. "We've got fighters regrouping at 2 o'clock. The Luftwaffe wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A final swarm of enemy fighters rose from hidden airfields, desperate to annihilate the no-vulnerable bombers on their retreat. But the P-51s, battered, low on ammo, half destroyed, turned to meet them. Nate didn't hesitate. "Eagles form on me." His voice rang with something new, a steadiness earned in fire. The self-doubt that had haunted him since Isaac's death evaporated. Responsibility wasn't a weight anymore. It was a calling they charged. Steel met steel. Fire met fire. The sky became a storm of twisting aircraft, bullets carving vicious paths through the air. Nate pulled behind a German fighter, fired his last bursts. The round stitched across the fuselage, sending it spiraling downward. Something slammed into his tail. Smoke filled his cockpit. Clementine groaned, shuddering violently. "I'm hit." Losing oil pressure, Nate rasped. Harris screamed, "Nate, bail out." "You've got to bail." "Negative," Nate growled, wrestling the controls. Not yet. A crippled Mi-109 limped ahead of him, the same one that had fired the devastating shots. The pilot turned, saw Nate, and for a split second, the two locked eyes through their canopies. A silent, understanding exchange between enemies. Then Nate rammed his smoking Mustang behind the German fighter, forcing it off the bomber's escape line. The Mi-109 dove sharply, too sharply, slammed into the hillside below in a fiery plume. But Clementine was done. Her engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Nate breathed once, steady. "Mayday, this is Eagle 7. I'm going down. I repeat, I'm going," the radio cut. He drifted into a glide, thick smoke trailing behind him like a wounded comet. The countryside below rushed upward. Green fields, winding roads, tiny farmhouses. For a moment, everything felt eerily peaceful. He thought of Isaac, of Foley, of the promise carved beneath his cockpit. At the last second, Nate pulled the canopy release, unlatched his harness, and threw himself into the open air. Wind roared past him. His parachute snapped open with brutal force, jerking him upward. Clementine plowed into a distant field and exploded in a burst of orange flame. Nate touched down in a grove of tall grass, rolling hard, pain shooting through his ribs. He lay still for several seconds, staring at the sky, now strangely calm. The distant drone of returning bombers echoed across the horizon. They had made it home. Not all of them, but enough. Hours later, a British resistance patrol found him, bruised and half-conscious, wrapped in his parachute. They smuggled him through the forest, across hidden roads, into the battered remnants of the Allied lines. It took days for Nate to reach his squadron again. When he arrived, hobbling on a wounded leg, Harris nearly tackled him in a crushing embrace. Jennings laughed and cried at the same time. Mechanics stopped working. Even Colonel Aldridge's steely composure cracked. "You did it," Harris whispered fiercely. "You crazy idiot. You brought them home?" Nate swallowed hard. "We did it," he corrected. In the days that followed, word spread through the group. The Schweinfurt raid had succeeded. Heavy losses? Yes. Brutal combat? Absolutely. But the factories were crippled. The Luftwaffe's ability to rebuild aircraft was severely damaged. For the first time in months, the tide in the European air war visibly shifted. On April 22, 1944, the U.S. Air Force achieved a decisive victory in the region, one the historians would later mark as a turning point in the struggle for air superiority. Nate attended the memorial service quietly, standing among rows of pilots with heads bowed. Foley's name echoed through the cold morning air. Nate felt tears sting his eyes, but this time he didn't hide them. Grief wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was love. It was proof that he was still human after everything war had tried to strip away. That night, sitting beside the empty airfield, he whispered, "Thank you, Clementine," to the fading horizon. The narrator closed the tale with a solemn warmth. Like the final frame of a film lingering before the credits, Nathaniel Hale returned to the skies months later, flying a new Mustang and carrying the ghosts of the fallen with him. But something within him had changed. The war had taken much, friends, innocence, certainty, yet it had given him purpose. And on that violent day above Schweinfurt, amid the fire and chaos, a young pilot discovered the courage to rise, fall, and rise again. The battle was won. The war continued. But for the U.S. Air Force, for the 322nd Fighter Group, and for Nathaniel Hale himself, April 11, 1944 would forever remain the day they fought the sky and won.